Think prison food was just bread and water? Not at Alcatraz. Behind those cold concrete walls, America's most dangerous men were getting roast beef, apple pie, and yes, even ice cream. Some inmates even said the meals were better than what they got at home. Today, we're digging into 25 delicious meals served in Alcatraz prison, the real dishes that fed mobsters, murderers, and men who'd never say no to second helpings. This is the America we remember, and by the end of this list, you might just be craving a slice of prison pie. 1. Scrambled eggs with toast and butter. Mornings at Alcatraz didn't start with a warm hug or a sunrise view. They started with a clang of metal doors and the unmistakable smell of scrambled eggs. Surprisingly, that wasn't a bad thing. Served hot and fluffy, the eggs were made in massive batches using real ingredients, not powdered substitute like in some other federal joints. The toast? Sliced white bread, lightly browned, and sometimes even served warm if you were lucky. A pat of butter, or margarine, depending on the decade, sat on the side like a tiny luxury. In a place where freedom was a memory, this meal gave inmates something solid to look forward to. It was filling, familiar, and just good enough to remind you of life on the outside. Even hardened gangsters didn't complain too much about this one. And if they paired it with a mug of hot government-issued coffee, that was about as close to comfort as life on the rock got. 2. Cottage fried potatoes. They weren't fancy, but they got the job done. Cottage fried potatoes, diced, pan-fried, and slightly crispy, were a staple on the Alcatraz breakfast tray, and for good reason. They were cheap to make, easy to cook in bulk, and had just enough salt and grease to make you forget you were locked up on a rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay. These weren't shoestring fries or fluffy hash browns. Think chunky cubes browned on the edges, soft in the middle, and usually swimming in just enough oil to slick your tray. Paired with eggs or a slab of fried meat, they rounded out the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and kept you going through yard time or laundry duty. Some inmates claimed they'd save the crispy bits for last like it was dessert. Others smuggled hot sauce from the kitchen crew for an extra kick. Either way, when these hit your tray, it wasn't just a side dish. It was a brief golden escape from institutional gray. 3. Fried Bologna and hotcakes. This was one of the strangest meals on the Alcatraz menu, but also one of the best. Fried Bologna and hotcakes might not sound like a perfect pair, but somehow it worked. The bologna was thick, salty, and cooked on a hot griddle until the edges curled up like little meat cups. Next to that came 2 big pancakes, soft, warm, and soaked in syrup. The sweet and salty mix hit the spot. Some guys said it was the closest thing to a diner breakfast they ever got behind bars. Others joked it tasted better than anything they had before prison. This meal didn't come around every day, so when it did, inmates noticed. They'd sit a little longer, eat a little slower, and maybe even trade for extra syrup if they could. It wasn't just food, it was a tiny break from prison life. And yeah, it might have looked strange on the tray. But once you took a bite, you didn't care. It was warm, filling, and just weird enough to be remembered. 4. Cereal with milk and sugar. It was plain, it was basic, but on some mornings a bowl of cereal was exactly what inmates needed. There were no brand names, just simple flakes or puffed grains dumped into a metal bowl. A splash of milk and a spoonful of sugar turned it into something that almost felt normal. It wasn't hot or fancy, but it was easy to eat and fast to serve. On cold mornings, some guys wished for something warmer. But on hot days or after a rough night, cereal was a quiet, no-nonsense breakfast. Inmates would sometimes trade sugar packets or save them to sweeten their coffee later. Others crushed up the cereal to make it last longer or dumped it all in one go like they were back in a high school cafeteria. It wasn't exciting, but it was safe. No surprises, just a bowl of crunch, a bit of sweetness, and a few calm minutes before the noise of the day kicked in. 5. Steamed whole wheat with syrup. This one surprised a lot of guys. It looked like mush, but tasted pretty good. Steamed whole wheat was served hot in a bowl, kind of like oatmeal, but thicker. It didn't have much flavor on its own, so the kitchen added syrup or molasses on top. That sweet touch made all the difference. It was warm, filling, and stuck to your ribs, which helped when you had hours of hard labor ahead. Some inmates stirred in extra sugar or swiped raisins off another tray to mix in. Little things like that made it feel more like a meal and less like a punishment. Older inmates liked it because it reminded them of breakfasts from the Great Depression. Younger guys just liked that it was easy to eat and didn't taste like prison food. It wasn't the prettiest thing on the tray, but it got the job done, and it kept a lot of hungry stomachs quiet through the morning. 6. Roast beef with brown gravy. This was the king of Alcatraz meals. Thick slices of roast beef covered in brown gravy showed up on special days, and inmates didn't mess around when it did. The meat was cooked in big batches, usually tender and juicy, then drowned in hot gravy that smelled better than anything else in the prison. It came with sides like mashed potatoes or green beans, but the beef was the star. Some guys even sopped up the leftover gravy with bread. For a few minutes, it almost felt like Sunday dinner back home. When this meal hit your tray, you didn't talk much. You ate. It was the kind of dish that made even the roughest inmates sit a little straighter and enjoy the moment. It reminded them that even in a place built for punishment, they could still have a good meal once in a while. Some even joked that it was the one day the guards were jealous. It made guys wish roast beef day came twice a week. 7. Chili con carne. This one packed flavor and heat. Chili con carne was a favorite because it was hearty, spicy, and made you forget you were stuck on an island prison. Big pots of beans, ground beef, and spices cooked slow in the kitchen until everything blended just right. It wasn't five-star chili, but for prison food it hit the spot. Some guys mixed in crackers for crunch or grabbed an extra scoop if the cook was in a good mood. The smell alone made it popular. Inmates would talk about Chili Day like it was a holiday. It filled you up, warmed you up, and stuck with you for the rest of the shift. It didn't last long on anyone's tray, that was for sure. Guys would line up early when they knew it was on the menu. It was one of the rare dishes that felt like it was made with actual care. For a few minutes, it made prison life feel a little more human. 8. Pork chops with mashed potatoes. Now this was comfort food with muscle. Thick-cut pork chops, cooked in giant batches, served next to a scoop of mashed potatoes. Simple, filling, and surprisingly tasty for prison food. The meat had just enough fat on the edge to keep it juicy, and when it was done right, you didn't need anything fancy on top. The mashed potatoes were soft and buttery, not too lumpy, and soaked up gravy like a sponge. Some meals came with a splash of brown sauce, which pulled everything together like a real home-cooked plate. When pork chop day rolled around, guys took notice. It was one of those meals that made the whole mess hall go quiet while trays were scraped clean. Even picky inmates who usually skipped meals didn't turn this one down. It reminded them of Sunday dinners, family meals, and simpler times before things went south. A good pork chop could turn a bad week into a better one, even if only for a moment. 9. Corned beef hash. It was greasy, it was salty, and it was gone fast. Corned beef hash was one of those meals that didn't look like much but had serious staying power. Chopped up corned beef, diced potatoes, and bits of onion were all tossed together and fried on a giant flat-top grill until the edges got crispy. When it was hot and fresh, the smell drifted through the mess hall and made even the quiet guys sit up straight. It wasn't pretty, but it was loaded with flavor, and that's all that really mattered. Some inmates mixed ketchup into it, while others folded it into bread like a makeshift sandwich. Everyone had their own way of eating it, but nobody left it on the tray. It was filling, easy to chew, and didn't feel like punishment on a plate. Guys would talk about hash day like it was a treat, and for a place like Alcatraz, that meant a lot. It wasn't gourmet, but it gave you a full belly and a good mood, and that was worth its weight in gold behind bars. 10. Chicken a la king. Now this was a surprise. Creamy, rich, and way fancier than it had any right to be in a prison. Chicken a la king was like getting hotel food on a metal tray. Chunks of chicken were mixed into a thick white gravy filled with peas, peppers, and little bits of mushroom. Sometimes it was served over toast, other times on rice or noodles, depending on what the kitchen had. Either way, it was warm, filling, and had real flavor. That creamy sauce coated everything and made it feel like someone in the kitchen actually cared, for once. Some guys joked that it made them feel civilized, like they were dining instead of just surviving. Others would trade extra bread just to soak up the last bit of sauce. It didn't come around often, but when it did, it was the talk of the cell block. For a few quiet bites, it made you forget where you were. It was one of those rare meals that brought a little comfort, even if the walls around you were cold and gray. 11. Creamed fish on toast. This wasn't anyone's dream dinner, but it sure made an impression. Creamed fish on toast meant small chunks of white fish floating in a thick white sauce that was poured over a slice of toasted bread. It looked a little sad on the tray, but it was hot, filling, and packed with protein. Some guys said it reminded them of Navy food. Others joked it tasted like the ocean lost a bet. Still, when you were hungry and stuck on an island with no choices, you ate what was in front of you. And the truth was, the sauce wasn't bad. Creamy, salty, and sometimes mixed with peas or soft onions. The toast underneath soaked everything up like a sponge. It got soggy fast, but that didn't stop most guys from finishing it. On some days, it was even better than the mystery meat they'd serve instead. Inmates called it ocean gravy or fish sludge, depending on their mood. But like most Alcatraz meals, it was a small break from the usual. Not great, but not the worst. And sometimes that was enough. 12. Spanish omelette with onions and peppers. This wasn't your average prison breakfast. The Spanish omelette was a colorful surprise, folded eggs packed with diced onions, bell peppers, and sometimes even little bits of potato. It came hot off the grill and smelled like something from a real breakfast diner. In a place known for gray walls and gray food, this dish actually had color. The peppers gave it a little sweetness, and the onions added some bite. Guys would slice it up with their forks like they were eating at a cafe instead of a high-security prison. It didn't show up often, but when it did, inmates knew they were in for a decent start to the day. Some even saved part of it to eat later in their cells. It was soft, savory, and just different enough to feel special. For 5 minutes, it wasn't just prison food, it was a real meal. And for the men on the rock, meals like this made the days just a little easier to face. 13. Rice and brown gravy. This was poor man's comfort food, but on Alcatraz, that made it gold. A scoop of soft white rice drowned in thick brown gravy landed on your tray looking plain, but it smelled like something warm and familiar. The gravy was salty, meaty, and a little peppery, poured heavy to make sure nothing went to waste. It was usually served alongside beans or leftover meat scraps from the night before. That gravy covered everything, rice, bread, even vegetables, and turned bland sides into something worth finishing. Some guys would mix the whole tray together into one big pile just to soak up every last drop. Nobody expected much from a meal like this, but it filled you up and stuck with you for hours. And in a place where second helpings were rare, rice and gravy gave you just enough fuel to get through a long day. It was cheap, easy to make in bulk, and didn't need much to be satisfying. Some inmates even called it prison stew, and honestly, it wasn't far off. 14. Frankfurters and sauerkraut. This meal came with a smell that hit you before the tray did. 2 pale frankfurters, basically hot dogs without the fun, were dropped next to a steaming pile of tangy sauerkraut. The dogs were boiled, not grilled, and the sauerkraut was sour enough to make you blink. But together, they worked. The frankfurters had a soft snap when you bit into them, and the cabbage cut through the salt with a little bite of vinegar. It wasn't exactly a ballpark meal, but for prison food it had flavor. Some inmates tucked the whole thing into a slice of bread and called it a rock dog. This combo wasn't loved by everyone, but it had a loyal following. especially among the older guys, who said it reminded them of meals back home during hard times. It was a simple dish that packed a punch, and if you were hungry enough, it tasted like something close to freedom. 15. Grilled cheese sandwich with tomato soup. Now this was a combo that felt like a warm hug on a cold day. A crispy grilled cheese sandwich, golden on the outside, gooey on the inside, served right next to a bowl of thick tomato soup. The sandwich was made from plain white bread and processed cheese, but something about the hot grill and melted center made it taste way better than it had any right to. The tomato soup was smooth, a little tangy, and perfect for dipping. Guys would tear off chunks of their sandwich and soak them in the red broth until it dripped off the edges. It was one of those meals that brought back memories of being a kid, sick at home, watching cartoons. Nobody traded this one away. In fact, some would try to snag extra if the guards weren't looking. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it hit all the right spots, warm, filling, and full of comfort. On days like this, the mess hall felt less like a prison and more like a kitchen from a life left behind. Just for a little while. 16. Beef stew with vegetables. Now, this was the kind of meal that made you feel like you were eating real food. Thick chunks of beef, soft potatoes, carrots, and peas, all floating in a dark, savory gravy. It came in big ladles, poured into deep trays, and it smelled like something slow-cooked, whether it was or not. The beef was sometimes tough, sometimes tender, kind of a mystery until you bit in. But the veggies were soft and full of flavor from the broth. It warmed you up from the inside out, especially on cold days when the fog rolled in heavy. Guys would dip their bread into the stew or mash everything together with a spoon. It was one of the rare times nobody complained about the food. It wasn't perfect, but it felt hearty, homemade, and a little bit like Sunday dinner back in the real world. 17. Beef pot pie, anglaze. This wasn't just any pot pie, it was Alcatraz's version of a fancy dinner. Anglaze just meant it was made the English way, but to the guys in the chow line, it meant one thing: meat wrapped in crust. And not just any meat. This was slow-cooked beef chunks tucked inside a golden, flaky pastry shell with thick gravy holding everything together. The crust was buttery and soft in the middle, with a crispy edge that clung to the pan. Inside, the beef was tender and mixed with small bits of carrots and potatoes. Every bite was rich and warm, like something you'd get at a corner diner on a cold day. It didn't look pretty, but it filled you up fast and made you feel human for a minute. It didn't feel like prison food. It felt like something that came with a cloth napkin and a real plate. And for men doing hard time, that feeling was worth everything. 18. Baked meat croquettes. Now this was a meal that sounded fancier than it looked, but it hit the spot. A meat croquette was basically a deep brown breaded log filled with a creamy mix of ground meat, mashed potatoes, onions, and seasoning. At Alcatraz, they were baked instead of fried, which meant a little less crunch, but a whole lot less grease, sliding around your tray. The outside was golden and crisp around the edges, while the inside was soft, savory, and packed with flavor. You'd break it open with your spoon, and steam would rise out like it came fresh from a real kitchen. Some guys liked to pour gravy over the top, or swipe extra ketchup packets from breakfast to jazz it up. Croquettes were different from the usual meatloaf or mystery meat. They felt like something your grandmother might have made during hard times, simple, clever, and made to stretch leftovers into something worth eating. For men locked away with nothing but routine, meals like this were small victories. 19. Roast tom turkey. This was as close as Alcatraz got to a holiday feast. Roast tom turkey showed up on special occasions, Thanksgiving, Christmas, or sometimes just when the kitchen had extra to use. The slices were thick and juicy if you were lucky, dry and chewy if you weren't. But either way, it was turkey, and turkey meant celebration. The meat came served with a ladle of brown gravy, sometimes with a scoop of stuffing or mashed potatoes on the side. The smell of roasted bird filled the mess hall, and for a brief moment it felt like something bigger than prison, like maybe there was still something to be thankful for. Some guys saved bites for last, others wolfed it down right away. A few would sit quieter during this meal, remembering family dinners they hadn't seen in years. It was more than food. It was a little piece of normal life tucked between bars and bad decisions. For just one tray, things didn't feel so far from home. 20 Spanish rice. This was one of the meals that added real color to an otherwise gray day. Spanish rice at Alcatraz was soft, steamy, and tinted a bright orange-red from tomatoes and spices. It came packed with little bits of green peppers, onions, and sometimes a few chunks of leftover beef or sausage if the kitchen had extras lying around. The rice was fluffy and full of flavor, not too spicy, but bold enough to wake up your taste buds. It was served in a big scoop, sometimes with beans or cornbread on the side, and guys would mix everything together into one hearty bite. It might not have been exactly like the real thing, but it was close enough for guys who hadn't had a home-cooked meal in years. The smell reminded some of backyard barbecues or family dinners back when life was still normal. It was warm, filling, and just different enough to make it stand out. Meals like this didn't just feed the body. They gave the soul a little something, too. 21 Baked beans and cornbread. This one was pure comfort on a tray. The baked beans came in a thick, sweet sauce, slow-cooked with bits of salt pork or onion for extra flavor. They were warm, sticky, and filled the mess hall with a smell that felt almost like a backyard cookout, if that cookout had bars on the windows. Right next to the beans sat a golden square of cornbread. It was soft in the middle, crumbly on the edges, and just sweet enough to count as a treat. Most guys would tear it up and mix it right into the beans, soaking up every last drop of that syrupy sauce. Others saved the cornbread for last, treating it like dessert. It wasn't just tasty, it was familiar. Beans and cornbread were served across America, especially in poor households, so for many inmates, this dish brought back memories of home, of hard times that still felt better than prison walls. Simple, hearty, and full of history, it was a meal that stuck with you long after the tray was empty. 22 Bacon jambalaya. Now this was one of the rare meals that actually got guys excited in the chow line. Bacon jambalaya showed up hot, steamy, and smelling like something from a southern kitchen. The dish was a mix of rice, tomatoes, onions, peppers, and big pieces of crispy bacon, all stirred together into a thick, savory pile that didn't need a single extra thing. The bacon brought a smoky, salty punch to every bite, and the juices soaked deep into the rice, giving it that rich flavor that stuck to your ribs. It wasn't spicy, but it had just enough seasoning to keep it interesting. Some guys called it the closest thing to real food we ever got in here. Even the guards cracked a smile when it was on the menu because they knew things would be quiet at lunch that day. It was a rare treat, a Southern-style surprise that made the rock feel a little less cold and a little more like the good old days. 23 Oatmeal cookies. Now this was a dessert that brought smiles even in a place like Alcatraz. Oatmeal cookies weren't fancy, but they were warm, chewy, and filled with just enough sweetness to make a guy forget where he was. For a minute, anyway. Made with rolled oats, cinnamon, brown sugar, and sometimes even a few raisins, these cookies came fresh from the prison bakery. They weren't too soft, not too hard, and always smelled like something homemade. In a place full of concrete and metal, that smell hit like a memory. Inmates would trade almost anything for an extra cookie. Some stashed theirs for later. Others couldn't wait and scarfed them down right after the meal. They were more than a snack. They were a moment of comfort, a reminder of childhood kitchens and after-school treats. And in a world where nothing came easy, a good cookie meant more than anyone on the outside could understand. 24 Bread pudding with raisins. This was the kind of dessert that felt like it came straight out of Grandma's oven, if Grandma was cooking for 200 inmates. Bread pudding with raisins was simple, sweet, and heavy in the best way. Made from leftover bread soaked in milk, eggs, and sugar, then baked until golden, it came out soft in the middle and crisp around the edges. The raisins added little pops of chewy sweetness, and sometimes there was even a drizzle of cinnamon or nutmeg baked right in. It wasn't pretty, but it tasted like a hug, warm, filling, and just sugary enough to count as a real treat. Most guys ate it slow, savoring each bite. Others scraped every last crumb from the tray like it was their last meal. And for many, it was the one thing on the menu that reminded them of home the most. In a place built on punishment, a scoop of bread pudding wasn't just dessert. It was a break from the grind, a bite of soft, sweet mercy. 25. Apple pie with whipped topping. Now this was the grand finale. Apple pie at Alcatraz was the kind of dessert that made even the toughest inmates stop and smile. The crust was thick and golden, the filling warm and gooey with chunks of soft apples and just enough cinnamon to make the whole mess hall smell like a diner. And then came the whipped topping. It wasn't fancy cream, more like the canned kind that melted quick. But no one cared. That dollop on top turned a basic pie into something that felt downright American. Some guys took tiny bites to make it last longer. Others devoured it in 3 chomps and licked their spoons clean. It didn't matter how you ate it, apple pie was gold behind bars. For just a few minutes, you weren't an inmate. You were a guy enjoying dessert, a guy remembering holidays, Sunday dinners, or backyard cookouts. It was the kind of ending that reminded you life still had flavor, even on the rock. So, who would have thought that behind bars, the food wasn't half bad? From beef stew to bread pudding, Alcatraz served up meals that could have passed for comfort food, if you ignored the guards and razor wire. These dishes weren't just calories, they were moments of normal in a place built to break you. Got a favorite from the list, or one your old man used to make? Drop it in the comments. And if this trip down memory lane made you smile, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to The America We Remember. We've got more stories, more flavors, and a whole lot more nostalgia waiting in the next video. See you next time.